Today's webinar, the author team of the National Climate Assessment Chapter on Tribes will talk about climate change impacts on tribes, drawing on findings from the chapter. And then we have one more webinar in the series on Friday, July 12th. This webinar will feature Mansell Nelson from ITEP's Environmental Education and Outreach Program, and he will provide information about outreach and education material and resources that tribes can use in engaging their tribal community. The webinar is being recorded, and the presentation will be posted on ITEP's Climate Change Webinars page. The way to ask questions is to type them into the chat box on the right side of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. And we ask that everyone please mute your line. Okay, so I put up some contact information for me and for Christina Gonzalez-Maddox, who is helping me put on the webinar series. Please contact us if you have any questions about the webinars. Okay, with that, I would like to get started. This presentation is going to be given by 5 of us. Bull Bennett, who is president of Kicksapa Consulting, Nancy Maynard, who is an emeritus scientist with NASA, Patricia Cochran, who is the executive director of the Alaska Native Science Commission, Kathy Lynn, who is the project coordinator for the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project at the University of Oregon, and me. And we would like to acknowledge the indigenous communities across the Western Hemisphere, the Tribal Input Technical Team. These are people who provided documents and other kinds of input that was considered for the National Climate Assessment. We also want to thank the full chapter team for the tribal chapter. Besides the 5 of us, there was also Bob Goff from the Intertribal Council on Utility Policy and Garrett Vogesser with the National Wildlife Federation. Okay, in this presentation, we will just talk briefly about the U.S. Global Change Research Program and the 2013 National Climate Assessment. We also want to mention a upcoming special issue of the journal Climatic Change, which will be focusing totally on tribes. We'll give a little background about tribes and traditional knowledge, and then we will be talking about impacts on tribes and forests and fires and food, water resources, changes in the Arctic. We'll talk about relocation issues, and then how you can get involved. And with that, I will turn it over to Bull Bennett, who will be talking about the U.S. Global Change Research Program.
Thank you, Sue. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are from. Again, my name is Bull Bennett. I'm the President and CEO for Kicksapa Consulting, but I'm also on the National Climate Assessment Development Advisory Committee. And I'm very honored to be here today. And wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how this effort began in response to a congressional mandate dating back to the late 90s. The mandate indicated that there should be a report that generates and assesses the condition of the country in terms of climate impacts and change. And so the first report had a very strong tribal input, largely led by Pat Spears and Bob Goff from Intertribal Coup, and featured prominently a lot of the tribal voice that was missing in the second report. The second report came out in 2009. Again, this is supposed to be a 4-year process, but in the early 2000s, there was a bit of a lapse, and so the energy to put this report together didn't occur until 2009. And then 4 years later, here we are generating the third rendition of the climate assessment report. And by design, this is an imperfect process. The idea is to be able to assess in an ongoing way the conditions that are happening across the country in terms of climate impacts. But specifically to our chapter, we had a tremendous opportunity to provide that tribal voice once again. And so the mandate to the Global Change Research Program, as is indicated on the slide here, is provide for development and coordination of comprehensive and integrated United States research program, which will assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural process of global change. Slide, please. So the outline for the 2013 report is listed here. Where the tribal chapter falls is if you go down about, I believe it's the fifth bullet down under sectors and sectoral crosscuts. These are identifying specific areas of climate impacts, but for the tribal chapter, because indigenous peoples exist not only in the various sectors and have stakeholders and investment in those sectors, but we're also geographically distributed across much of the continent and also including the Pacific Islands. And so because the indigenous concerns about climate impacts, local impacts, are relevant across all sectors, then the specific tribal chapter was cross-sectoral in nature so that it will be accounted for in many of the sectors. Slide. So specifically, Chapter 12 of the assessment is the one that's focused on impacts of climate change on tribal, indigenous, and native lands and resources. I want to spend a minute here to describe the process. This process began really in 2010, where the Executive Secretariat was formed out of the GCRP, and from that appointments were made to the Climate Assessment Committee. I was among those that were selected to serve in that capacity, and so right away the initiative was to gather folks from across Indian country to contribute to this effort. And so in the course of 2011 through March, or up until March 1st of 2012, was a public call for technical inputs. And the challenge was to engage a number of tribes, well, really to provide as diverse a tribal voice as we possibly could. And so we reached out both through the technical input team as well as through the committee to as many tribal organizations as possible to garner information to provide to the assessment. We had an overwhelming response from Indian country specific to this chapter. We had well over 200 technical inputs. From those technical inputs, we were able to, between March 1st of 2012 through June 1st of 2012, we were able to draft what became the first iteration of this chapter. There were 5 key messages or findings that we found. Again, because we were cross-sectoral in nature, where tribes are impacted and are involved with many of the sectors described in the document. And then we came to these findings that were based on evidence that was provided in these technical inputs. We also identified new information and remaining uncertainties, and the assessment, the confidence was based on the evidence that was provided through the technical input process. And the technical inputs ranged from interviews with elders, oral traditions that were passed along, as well as written reports, graphics, documents, and a number of other different sources. And the draft of the assessment, we've already been through 2 revision periods now. The draft can be found, as you see in the link at the bottom of the slide here. So I would encourage the audience to go out and take a look, not just at the tribal chapter, but look at the document as a whole and the contribution that the tribal chapter makes.
This is Kathy Wynn. As a result of the National Climate Assessment Tribal Chapter the editors of the Climatic Change Journal invited the author team to basically create a special issue. And this was a very significant opportunity because while the National Climate Assessment Tribal Chapter provides a great opportunity, it's a very limited amount of space. And so we were really struggling to capture the range of issues that tribes are facing in regards to climate change and the research that's been done in those areas within the National Climate Assessment. So this special issue is a collaborative effort by over 50 authors representing tribal communities, academia, government agencies, and non-governmental groups. The articles explore the issues currently experienced by Indigenous communities across the United States in regards to climate change, including the loss of traditional knowledge, forests and ecosystems, food security and traditional foods and water, Arctic sea ice, permafrost thaw, all of the issues that we're going to be talking about today during the webinar that are captured in the National Climate Assessment Chapter. These articles, there are 13 articles in total, 10 have already been posted on this link that you see on Springer.com. If you don't have access directly through Springer.com, you can contact the authors of those individual articles, and at least the titles of the articles and the authors of those articles are something that we should be able to make available soon. All of the articles will be available online in July and in a published format, printed format this fall. So if that's something that you're interested in, either Sue Watkins or myself, we can send you the list of articles by title, and again, that's something that you can contact individual authors for copies of. Next slide.
Thank you, Kathy. To give a little bit of background about how we went about this process, there's 566 federally recognized tribes, but there are also a plethora of other indigenous groups that were included in this process. There were 5.2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives across the country, and again, those were primarily from the recognized groups, but there are other state and non-recognized groups that are still very much identified with their traditional cultures and values. In the lower 48, 56 million acres is defined by reservation lands, and then although chapter-bordered, it identifies the geographic boundaries of reservation lands in the lower 48 through townships, reservations, and communities. Also in Alaska, there are 44 million acres that are held by Alaska Native corporations. And I believe if you were to combine all of Indian country, including the Alaska Native corporations, it would be equivalent to the 5th largest state in the country. So there's a tremendous amount of land holdings and consequently resources that the tribes are responsible for management and oversight. Most of the reservations are small. Often they're both economically as well as resource challenged as well. There's, as anybody who's spent time in Indian country understand, there's ongoing and chronic socioeconomical conditions like extreme poverty, certainly substandard housing, health and community services, access to healthy foods, infrastructure, transportation, education, employment, cost of fuels, and the list goes on. And it was found that much of this is exacerbated by changing climatic conditions, and so the tribes and indigenous populations are faced with having to respond and adapt against the backdrop of these chronic conditions across Indian country. But one thing is held true throughout, and that is the indigenous relationship with the land and their respective relationship with place. And that is held true both through the traditional passing on of knowledge as well as the literature that has been produced as well. Slide. So right out of the chute with this chapter, we wanted to set the tone by discussing the importance and relevance of traditional knowledge in terms of providing input to the climate assessment process and specifically to climate impact in Indian country, but also because there is such a rich and robust source of data across all of Indian country. And one can argue that the diversity is of those technical inputs are as diverse as those that are reporting out. And so we truly have a rich contribution to this climate assessment process, but also in terms of developing adaptation mitigation strategies that are largely grounded in the indigenous traditional cultures. So it's really important for us as chapter authors in the team to make sure that we got off in a good way. And so in one instance, traditional knowledge is defined as a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed through generations by cultural transmission. In a more indigenous definition, we look at traditional knowledge as all of the knowledge, collective knowledge, that is known about the world around us and how our relationship applies in relation to those beings that share our world. So once again, there's very important information. It's very diverse, it's very robust, and it's a very rich source of information that is a significant contribution, not only to the chapter, but also to the ongoing process. So within the context of our efforts with the traditional knowledge portion of the chapter, we focused on language, ceremonies, cultural practices, food that have evolved in places, and what climate impacts might mean towards those resources. Also includes the wisdom and knowledge of the native people that reside in songs and dances, art, language, music, and so on. It is conducted with respect to both people and also inclusive of plants and animals, as well as what some might constitute as non-living things, but where most indigenous cultures have a very strong relationship to those things, like rocks and mountains and other features across the landscape. Also, in terms of traditional knowledge, looking at it as a method of recording historic weather and climate variability and impacts, and in some cases with winter counts and other ways that have historically been recorded by indigenous populations. These become important factors and contributions to looking at historical events that have occurred through time, but also in terms of being able to measure and project what kind of impacts will happen across Indian country into the future. And so traditional knowledge really becomes a featured element in terms of understanding not only where we are, but how we can adapt in a sustainable and resilient sort of way as indigenous people. But certainly, as I indicated in the previous slide, that given the social economical conditions that are prevalent across Indian country, we're looking at losses of some of that traditional knowledge as our elders, our knowledge keepers that hold that knowledge of language, culture, ceremonies, relationship, this sense of place that we identify as all of our relations. As that knowledge passes with our elders, the threat of losing that becomes underscored by the impacts of climate change on Indian country.
As is stated in one of the key messages in the tribal chapter, the observed and future impacts from climate change, which include wildfires, temperature rise, changes in sea ice, and ecosystem changes, are threatening indigenous access to traditional foods and traditional ways of life. The impacts of climate change on forests and ecosystems in particular are expected to have direct effects on culturally important plant and animal species, which will in turn affect tribal sovereignty, culture, and economies. The observed impacts from the causes and consequences of climate change include species loss and shifts in species range. And one of the issues that we try to focus on are how that will impact the ability of tribes to access those resources, whether it's through treaty and reserved rights or just access to those species that may be shifting off reservation or beyond where there are tribal relationships with federal agencies or other entities managing those lands. the loss of biodiversity, the impacts of culturally important native plants and animals, and increases in invasive species are posing great risks and have been observed already in the Southwest, across much of the West, and in Alaska. Next slide. Wildfire is threatening native and tribal homes, safety, economies, culturally important species, and medicinal plants. Rising temperatures and hotter and drier summers are projected to increase the frequency and intensity of large wildfires that are having these impacts. And warmer, drier, and longer fire seasons and increased forest fuel load are projected to lead to insect outbreaks and the spread of invasive species, dry grasses, and other fuel sources, all of which will increase the risks to tribal resources. Next slide. Of great interest to tribes that we're exploring in this chapter are the impacts to the local plant and animal species that tribes have a relationship with for food, for medicinal ceremonies, to community and economic health. And these medicinal and food plants are becoming increasingly difficult to find or are no longer occurring in some historic ranges. The subsequent shifts from traditional lifestyles and diet, which are exacerbated by persistent poverty, food insecurity, the cost of non-traditional foods, and even poor housing conditions, have led to increasing health problems in communities, increasing the risk to foods and resource security. Climate change is also likely to amplify other indirect effects to traditional foods and resources, including limiting access to gathering places and hunting grounds and environmental pollution. The chapter explores a range of specific plants and animal species that indigenous peoples in the United States have historically depended upon, including the list that you see in front of you: seals, fish, shellfish, bison, bear, caribou, wild rice, cottonwood trees. This is just a very small example of the plant and animal species that tribes have a relationship with that are expected to be impacted by climate change. I'll draw your attention back to the special issue of the Climatic Change Journal, because that issue and the articles within that issue go into great detail about many of these species that are listed here and others, and I think will provide a lot of kind of case study examples of the ways in which climate change is expected to impact traditional foods and other issues that we've talked about here. Next slide.
Okay, this is Sue Watkins. I'll talk briefly about the water resources. Tribes have been seeing changes in precipitation patterns and an increase in extreme weather events, and this is impacting their water supplies and water management. Some of the changes have been a decrease in water quantity and quality. That's caused not just by climate change but other factors as well, and this is having an effect on drinking water supplies, food, cultures, ceremonies, and traditional ways of life. Bull already talked about some of the vulnerabilities that tribes already have caused by socioeconomic conditions, and climate change exacerbates this. The adaptive capacity of tribes and vulnerabilities are exacerbated by land use policies, political marginalization, legal issues associated with tribal water rights, and poor economic conditions. The Climatic Change Journal will have an article specifically on water resources that goes into quite a bit some of the vulnerabilities. I'll give a few examples just from a few different regions of some observations that have been made by tribes. On the Colorado Plateau, Navajo elders have observed drought and long-term decreases in snowfall, a decline in surface water features. In some cases where there once had been a perennial stream, it's now intermittent. Sand dunes have been mobilized with the changing climate. The photo on the bottom right was one I just took a few weeks ago on the Navajo Nation, and you can see a sand dune right by a roadway. Sand dunes have been moving and impacting roadways, houses, rangeland. There have been impacts on agriculture and livestock. They've observed losses of springs and medicinal and culturally important plants and impacts on the drinking water supply. In the Pacific Northwest, tribal treaty rights are being affected by changes in the climate, causing reduced rainfall and snowpack, melting glaciers, rising temperatures, shifts in ocean currents. In the Northwest, tribes are concerned about the subsequent effects on salmon, which is a very important kind of fish for them. There have been an increase in storm intensities and sea level rise, so tribes along the coast are concerned about being impacted and possibly having to move their communities away from the shoreline. In Hawaii, the native Hawaiians have observed a shorter rainy season, increasing intensity of storms and flooding, and a rainfall pattern that is becoming unpredictable. In Alaska, there has been permafrost thaw, and that is causing damage to the water infrastructure, which then impacts the water quality, quantity, and availability. And I'm going to go to the next slide, and Patricia Cochran will be speaking more about some of the impacts in the Arctic. Okay, Patricia?
Well, good morning or good afternoon to some. Let me first of all acknowledge all my relations online and thank you for joining us. I'm happy to be with you today. Let me talk a bit about the things that we're seeing here in the Arctic, which are many, many impacts of climate change. First of all, looking at decreasing the sea ice thickness and extent, we're seeing a lot of loss of multi-year ice, which to us is really important in the Arctic because in many of our communities that ice pack is what has been protecting our communities from erosion and flooding happening in our communities. So the loss of our sea ice is really important to us. We're also seeing a lot more extreme weather and severe storms, including the changes in the directionality of winds that again impacts our sea ice. We're seeing a real increase in temperatures. For those of you who've been watching the weather reports here in Alaska over the last few weeks here, like the last 2 or 3 weeks here in Alaska have been really warm. One of the unfortunate parts that we're seeing is that that means that we're seeing a lot more in lightning strikes. So right now we have about a 500,000 acre fire that's burning in the interior of Alaska. So these things are really important and meaningful to what's happening in our communities. We're also seeing a lot of changes in our sea ice melt, the lakes and the rivers. If you can see the upper picture, there is a picture of Kayakuk, one of the communities that's along the Yukon River. Many of you might have heard in the news recently again of the number of villages that have had to be removed from their homes because of the floods. In Galena, all of that entire population had to move out of their community and have been moved into Anchorage, Fairbanks, and other communities. They've lost much of their infrastructure. Many of the homes have been destroyed by the flood that just ran through our communities. We're seeing a lot of changes in species ranges, including the change in many of the populations because of the rising tree line. For instance, where I grew up in Nome, way up in the northwestern part of the state, we never used to have beaver in our communities at all because we didn't have a source of food for them. Now, because of the increasing temperatures, we're seeing a change in the tree line, and that has meant that the beaver have moved into our areas. We are now inundated with the beaver population. We're seeing a lot of changes in our feeding and denning, breeding habitats for many of our Arctic animals. The polar bear have actually begun to see some interesting adaptation measures that have taken place within the polar bear. We're beginning to see, in looking at some of the recent research on stomach contents of polar bear, that they're now beginning to hunt more on land than on the sea because their food source is not available out on the ice, and they have to go further and further between ice flows to be able to hunt. We're also seeing some real decreases in our salmon populations for many reasons. Some of them are climate related, having to do with drying of our streams, changes in water temperatures, so that it's not allowing the fish fry to survive and thrive. Next slide, please. We're also seeing the injury from extreme and unpredictable weather, which has for us unfortunately meant a loss of many lives within our communities. A lot of our people, there's hardly any of us who have gone out, who don't know people who have gone out hunting and simply never come back home again. The rivers and the sea ice conditions are treacherous. It does mean that people, like for instance our whalers up north, have been trapped on sea ice, have had to be flown back by helicopter because they've broken off on floes that have been gone out to sea. And these are people who really know the areas quite well. And when you're trying to go whale hunting and to drag a whale back to your community, there's a real difference in having to hunt where we used to only 2 or 3 miles offshore, and now some are having to go 20, 30 miles offshore in order to get that same whale. It makes a real big difference when you're coming back in a skin boat and trying to bring the whale back into your community. We're also seeing a lot of changes in the snow and ice conditions, again meaning less safety in our hunting and fishing, malnutrition and food insecurity. One of the things I talked about was the beaver moving into our area. Along with the beaver, it's not just them moving into those areas, but they've also contaminated our water, our spring water systems, because they're damming the water, they're affecting the salmon populations, the moose habitat. But they also bring giardia, something we've never had to worry about before with our clear spring waters. So that's another issue that we're looking at in contamination of our food and water resources and diseases that are moving in. The loss of our culture and livelihood is a really major issue. Not all of our own making. Most of you know that many of these places that our communities are now residing used to be seasonal camps. There were people were semi-nomadic and moved from place to place depending upon the food resource and what they were hunting at the time, conditions, etc. Many of those communities were located in the river areas now, or along the water areas, by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, because that was where there was most easy access to be able to barge in equipment and to locate the communities there when school systems and other things became mandated. And it does leave a real catch-22 for those people living in our communities now, because they're not only experiencing all of these losses within their communities because of climate change, but also many agencies that now don't want to fund any of the infrastructure that's being damaged, because they say, well, you're going to have to be relocated anyhow, so if you lose your school or your lands or your airport, so what? So it's really a difficult situation we find ourselves in. Next slide, please. We've talked a little bit already about the permafrost thaw and what that has already done to many of our areas, and this is a real huge issue. Looking at, again, the erosion and flooding that is happening, things that destruction of our homes, our infrastructure, things that are really important to our communities, like our airports, for instance. You can see in the picture here on the upper picture there, that's a thaw that's been happening in the interior area, and that's just one of the issues that we're seeing, where the permafrost melts are really impacting all of the lands around us. We're looking at least 30 and more villages here in Alaska that have to be moved. When you consider that 85% of our communities are coastal communities, again, located or relocated to those areas, not always of our own making. So that's a major issue that will be happening not only to those communities that are already impacted, but to another at least 100 or 200 additional communities. Public health issues are very severe to us. Again, looking at sanitation issues, the sewage contamination that's coming because of these permafrost melts when your sewer and water systems are being destroyed by the permafrost. We're seeing the melting of many of the ice cellars, someplace where we've been able to store our food for a long period of time. One of the most interesting research articles I was just reading about was the number of caves in Siberia that are now melting, and the amount of outgassing that's going to come because of those the melting ice cellars in Alaska, the permafrost, and the caves in Siberia. As most of us know, the melting of permafrost also brings the outgassing of methane, which is a very serious issue for all of us here in the Arctic. So I guess I'd like to just close by saying that we're all really concerned about the cost of moving of our communities. There simply just is no agency out there that seems to want to take responsibility for moving communities that are maybe anywhere from 50 to a few hundred people at the cost of up to $200 to $400 million to move each of these communities. So we're looking at some ways that we can begin to build our own models of self-reliance and sustainability that will help our communities. And I hope we'll begin to talk more about some of the self-reliance models that will hopefully help our communities to survive and thrive. Thank you all.
Hi, this is Nancy Maynard. I'm at the University of Miami now. And I'll be picking up on what Patricia has just very eloquently said about this whole relocation issue, which is a very serious issue for Native tribes and communities. And it results from the combination of many of these impacts, as she pointed out. Sea level rise, erosion, permafrost thaw, or the increased intensity of weather events, and forcing the relocation of entire tribal communities in Alaska, Louisiana, Pacific Islands, any coastal areas. And it's rather a sad irony in that Native peoples are not strangers to relocation, sadly. Given the history of this country and the relocations that were forced back in the 1800s and moving tribes west, north, to Oklahoma later. And anyway, and in terms of the present situation of relocation, as she talked about, several examples of the relocation issue, which are at critical stages right now, whether you're talking about Newtok, Kipalina, or Shishmaref in Alaska. infrastructure, drinking water, sanitary infrastructure, anything like that. And this is, as she also pointed out, relocation has been impeded almost completely by existing federal and state statutes, regulations, any absence of authority, governance structure to facilitate these relocations. There's no structure to make this happen by the government. A second example of relocation in addition to Alaska is in coastal Louisiana, for example. They have slightly different issues with sea level rise, saltwater intrusion. They're very low at the sea level right now, intense erosion, land loss, separate cause. In that case, it would be, let's say, oil and gas development, infrastructure development nearby, so they can't just move to higher ground if there were any, or move over a bit away from the coast, because the land is all developed now. And as Patricia said, the primary problem is the impediments to relocation, the fact that there is no institutional framework in this country to relocate an entire community. The government agencies don't have legal authority or technical expertise. They don't have the organization. It's a huge organizational issue to move families, an entire village, and funding apparently isn't there either, and as she pointed out. So it's a very, very serious issue, and we all in the chapter feel really strongly that we hope that our chapter will help encourage some sort of immediate attention to the fact that that new governance institutions are really urgently needed to respond to this necessity. And action is way overdue, and we sure hope that this chapter can help contribute to some solutions or movement. Sue?
Yep. Thank you, Nancy. So this is Sue Watkins again. Just want to close with just some ideas what you can do. One is learn more about climate change and its impacts on tribes. Just the fact that you're on this webinar is showing that you're interested in learning more. And you can sign up for ITEP's Tribal Climate Change newsletter. I send it out every month. It has lots of information about tribes and climate change and resources and funding opportunities and upcoming events. You can get involved with tribal climate change networks and initiatives. There are a number of them out there. I can provide information, as can other presenters. You can educate your tribal leadership and community about climate change. Start that climate change conversation with your tribe. You can work with your tribe to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And you can work with your tribe to prepare and plan and adapt to climate change impacts. You can get involved with a national climate assessment, read the reports, provide input to future reports. You can contact the U.S. Global Change Research Program, regional climate science centers, landscape conservation cooperatives to get information, but also to get more tribal involvement in some of these national and regional climate change initiatives. So those are just some ideas. There are other things that you could do. And so with that, I want to allow you time to ask questions. You can do that by typing in questions into the chat box. And Christina will be reading out the questions, and one or several of the presenters will try to address the question. I do want to point out that the webinar presentation will be archived on ITEP's Climate Change webinar page, and here's the URL. And if you go to the last slide, we also have the contact information for each of the presenters. So with that, Christina, have there been any questions typed in?
Hi, Sue. We actually have some questions that were emailed in during the registration process, and I'll just direct these to the group and allow the presenters to respond as it's appropriate. The first one here is what are some basic practical ways that agencies can support and or incorporate different types of traditional ecological knowledge in order to inform effective climate change adaptation solutions?
Bull, would you like to try to address that, or anyone else?
Yeah, could you repeat that question, please?
Absolutely, Bull. The question was, what are some basic practical ways that agencies can support and or incorporate different types of traditional ecological knowledge in order to inform effective climate change adaptation solutions?
That is an excellent question. I think it begins with relationship building and trust. I think anytime that we're dealing with problem solving, and specifically in light of adaptation and in some cases mitigation strategies, it really boils down to building sound relationships that are based on trust. So I would encourage our agency colleagues, and I'll even call them family, to go shoulder to shoulder with indigenous peoples to incorporate elder perspectives, as well as the emerging leadership perspectives, as well as the youth. So we have a comprehensive base from which to generate the solution. So that would probably be step one. Once those relationships are built, and then of course the solutions are going to be as unique to the area of interest as well as to the specific adaptation measure that would be adopted. And so that would probably be step two, would be in solution building. And then certainly reaching out to existing entities and organizations that have been gathering, archiving, publishing, and providing exposés on different climate impacts across Indigenous America. Those entities would be like ITAP, and then also Pacific Northwest. Reach out to Patricia up in the Alaska Native Science Commission. Reach out to them and to engage in education opportunities, to engage in strategies for developing community-based efforts, grassroots-based efforts to address issues locally. The thing is climate change impacts the entire globe, but the adaptation and solutions to this happen at a very local scale, and it has to be unique to that specific area. And so to begin, that's where I would start with relationship building, so, focusing on solutions, and then reaching out to those resources that are available to us currently, and then demanding additional resources that could be brought to bear to mitigate and to adapt to the effects of climate impacts.
Great, thank you so much, Bull. Oh, sorry. Patricia? Or Nancy?
Hi, it's Nancy Maynard. I have a suggestion. I think probably one particularly effective thing that agencies could do would be to set up a STEM, science, technology, education, and math internship program, like the summer internship programs, or some, if you have them year-round. At NASA, we have them primarily during the summer. And put out a call to either tribal colleges or students indigenous students who could apply for a STEM internship program at the agency, or out in Indian country, because remember, a lot of students can't travel away from families and that sort of thing, but they sure can do some powerful research out at the tribal colleges, which we learned certainly at NASA. It was extremely valuable. And if you phrase the opportunity for the internships such that it's to combine indigenous knowledge and science, whatever the agency's particular science, whether it's energy for Department of Energy or environment, EPA, or something like that. You get a really, our students have been absolutely fantastic, and they come up with incredible ideas of projects that are directly applicable to both the agency's mission as well as the, let's say, adaptation and mitigation needs of the tribes. So I highly recommend, if you can get some sort of internship program, a lot of bright young people out there that can create some solutions.
And this is Kathy. I just wanted to mention that many of the climate science centers and landscape conservation cooperatives developed through the Department of Interior strategy are starting to develop tribal engagement strategies. And some of those are thinking about the role of traditional knowledge in understanding climate change impacts and adaptation strategies. And so I think it's worthwhile for anyone interested in kind of making these connections to look at some examples of what landscape conservation cooperatives may be doing. The North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative in particular has developed a science and traditional ecological knowledge strategy. So looking to some of those examples that are bringing together agencies and tribes to understand that role may be a good strategy.
So Kathy, you actually gave us a perfect segue into the next question, which is how can LCCs better engage with tribes, or what's being done in terms of tribal engagement on the part of LCCs?
Do you want me to, I can take that, or at least initially?
Sure, that would be great. Thanks, Kathy.
Well, as I just mentioned, there are a number of individual LCCs and climate science centers that are starting to develop tribal engagement strategies. There is a very recently appointed Federal Advisory Committee for Climate Science Centers, and there's also in the process of being developed a national LCC network. And I think both of those national level committees will be a place to kind of gather information or hopefully share information about how various LCCs are engaging with tribes. And I think there's a lot of, I think it's worth making the connections between the landscape conservation cooperatives and the climate science centers. Another example is the South Central Climate Science Center is in the process of bringing together tribes in that region to understand opportunities and issues that tribes are concerned with or have an interest in engaging with the agencies around climate change. And so also the Great Lakes Landscape Conservation Cooperative, I believe, has engaged to some extent with the College of Menominee Nation and a professor at Michigan State University, Kyle Powis-White, on starting to engage tribes. I mentioned the North Pacific Landscape Conservation Cooperative, which extends from southeast Alaska to northern California. So there are definitely growing examples, and I think one of my hopes is that there will be some sort of clearinghouse where you can see these examples, whether it be on a map or things like that, as a start through the Tribes and Climate Change website that ITAP manages, and also through our Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project. We're trying to get information about those efforts up on our profiles. So that's one place that my hope is that we'll start to see more of this in the future.
Okay, well, so there were several questions posed by the audience about specific impacts on water and on plant populations, but also on sort of regional impacts. Would you be able, presenter team, to please provide some guidance in terms of where our participants can look for regionally specific impacts of climate change on ecosystems?
This is Kathy in the Pacific Northwest, the Climate Impacts Research Consortium, and the the Northwest Climate Science Center. There are a number of new tools and resources available in the Northwest, and maybe, Christina, I can send you some links that could be shared with this group afterwards.
That would be great, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, this is Sue. In the Southwest, there was recently released the Southwest Climate Assessment Report, which I think would be worth taking a look at. And there are some other resources available specific to the Southwest. I'd be happy to share links and so on. If anyone's interested, they can send me an email. So I think, you know, addressing that question in general is look to regional climate science centers and other groups and organizations that are working on regional issues on climate change.
This is Patricia. Maybe I can add a couple of things as well. Here in the Arctic, we have quite a number of various locations you can go and look for resources, including the Climate Change Center at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. We have the Alaska Climate Change Working Group that's been part of the former governor's task force on climate change here in Alaska. We have a lot of information on our website, the Alaska Native Science Commission. We've got the Arctic Alliance, that is a network of both indigenous organizations and environmental NGOs that does a monthly newsletter or online information and resource sharing. So there's that. We also have the Many Strong Voices campaign that's part of the United Nations network with a relationship that's firmly established between the Arctic and the small island developing states, including Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. We've got the Indigenous Peoples Global Network on climate change, so there really are a lot of resources that are out there, probably too many to name, but I'd be happy to provide some of those lists to folks who are interested.
Excellent. So maybe what we can do is if the presenter team has specific resources that they'd like to share with the participants of this webinar, we can go ahead and I'll collect those emails and send out a group email to all of the participants, if that sounds good to all of you. So our next question was...
Thanks, Christina.
Oh, thank you, Sue. So the next question actually has to do more with sort of reducing localized impacts of climate change that are, exacerbated by human stressors. And this specific example lists groundwater resources. This question was submitted by a tribe in California. And the question is, what kinds of things can be done to reduce the combined human and climate change impacts to water resources that compromise a tribe's ability to reside on indigenous lands?
I think it's going to really depend on the exact situation of the tribe, but the tribe's going to have to look at how they're being impacted and try to come up with strategies on how to address those impacts. So for instance, the issue of impacts on groundwater, they will need to try to identify possibly other sources of water, maybe need to institute water collection systems. I know the Wallapai tribe in northwestern Arizona is really looking to the future and has established some water collection, pretty big water collection systems to capture the water that's coming from that down as precipitation. But I think it really, you're going to have to look at your own particular situation and what's available.
Yeah, and to follow on with Sue, this is Will Bennett. One of the things that maybe not all of the tribes, but those tribes that have negotiated treaties that include water jurisdictions, make sure that when we're sitting at the negotiation table with the other stakeholders, whether it be municipalities, fisheries, whoever the stakeholder might be, it's always best to come at it from a position of strength. And so if those treaties are available and are part of tribal governance, then making sure that those are brought to bear in those questions. The second thing is getting back to a point I made earlier, is relationship building with those stakeholders, because what's going to happen is there's going to be increased competition for a reducing resource, and oftentimes, as history has bared out, the tribes have ended up on the short end of the stick. And so the idea is leadership development within, making sure that the current and emerging leaders from each of the tribes are well versed in tribal law as it relates to their water jurisdictions, but also in terms of their resource management and STEM capacities. What I mean by STEM, I mean science, technology, engineering, and math. And if our tribal leadership is versed in these kind of technologies, including having robust data sets that are inclusive of managing those tribal resources, the next enables the tribes to come to the negotiation table from a position of strength. And so I would encourage each of those tribes to exercise the treaty rights. For those that may not have treaty rights, again, it's certainly making sure that they are sitting at the table, and to borrow a phrase from Gary Collins, our colleague in Northern Arapaho, if you're not at the table, then chances are you're on the menu. And for tribal people, it's best for us to be sitting at the table.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. There were a couple of questions here that were quite specific, and that I will share with the presenter group, and hopefully you can follow up individually with these couple of, again, very specific questions from participants. But other than that, we've not received any questions via the chat line. If anybody would like to submit any final questions, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I think that concludes this webinar. Sue?
Christina, I don't know if there's on the above the chat box, there's a box of questions. Did you look at those?
Okay, it looks like we've got a couple. Unfortunately, I'm not able to view them all that clearly. Okay, there we go. Okay. Okay, so this is a question from one of the participants. What are the current procedures for relocating Alaska Natives? Patricia, maybe you could respond to that?
Well, the unfortunate part of that is that there really is not a system that's in place for communities to move or to be moving. Some communities have taken it upon themselves to begin the process. For instance, Newtalk, I didn't have a chance to talk a lot about individual communities and what they're doing, but we've got quite a bit of information, and we've been working pretty closely with the folks in Newtalk. They are one of the communities that is actually in the process of relocating their community inland from where they're presently located, because they've lost much of their infrastructure. But as I said, the truth of the matter is there really is not a good process. There have been some inroads made into that through the working group, the climate change working group, for those communities that have been talking about this issue for quite a number of years. So There just, again, unfortunately, there isn't a solution. There are a lot of communities that are looking at numerous potentials, including working with the various federal agencies to assist in pieces of the move, whether it's building the airport, whether it's building homes within their communities, sanitation systems. All of those, unfortunately, are different agencies. So it's a matter of trying to coordinate and facilitate all of those groups to come together, and that's the piece that's really missing.
Thank you, Patricia, for responding to that question. Another sort of Alaska Pacific Northwestern question from the same participant. What is happening with glacier melts and support of Pacific Northwestern salmon?
Mrs. Sue, I don't know specifically. I know there have been, salmon reintroduction efforts and work on riparian restoration. Perhaps, I don't know, Kathy, do you know of some specific things related to the climate change impacts?
One of the articles that there are a couple of articles in the special issue that I think could provide some good references. One by Kyle Dittmer with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. And I mean, there's also, I think what I'm going to do is take this question and put it in my notes that I send links and resources to Christina for. But I think that Kyle Dittmer's article could be of particular value to this question. But maybe if there's a more specific question this person could submit, that we could provide some more direct resources.
This is Patricia. Maybe I can just give a little bit of information on some of the glacier melting, because that has been a huge problem, as most people know, here in the Arctic, that we have seen all across the Arctic the melting of all of our glaciers here in Alaska, with the exception of the Hubbard Glacier, which is the only advancing glacier that we have seen here in the state. We were having real problems with glacier melts all over. Also looking to other circumpolar areas, the Greenland ice sheet. People have obviously heard a lot about what's happening with the melting of the Greenland ice sheet, but it's not just here, it's really worldwide. Looking at the melting glaciers in the Andes and the Himalayas, all of those things are exacerbating the input of water into all of the water systems worldwide. So that is going to have a human impact on communities all over the world, and is already starting to be felt. So I think that this is a major issue that people need to look at from a global perspective.
Thank you so much, Patricia and Kathy and Sue. Here's a question from one of our participants. Can EPA get better climate change forecasting for tribes and coastal communities based on the newest science, using the ranges of impacts sort of ranging from worst case scenarios, it sounds like. And it seems like this person is commenting that seems to be a pretty critical starting point for protection of fisheries, wildlife, ecosystems, sea level rise, etc. Essentially having that information, that climate change predictive power, would be really useful for tribes in safeguarding themselves and resources. Are there plans to trend in the direction of increased forecasting, or is there sort of more localized data that's available to tribes that they can utilize in developing vulnerability assessments and adaptation strategies?
Mrs. Sue, I don't know if EPA specifically is going towards doing this. I would suggest contacting the regional climate science centers maybe as an early step, and they may be able to provide that kind of information. Does anyone else have suggestions on that?
This is Patricia. I guess one of the things that I think that EPA could really utilize their tribal environmental specialists that they have here in Alaska that are funded by EPA, because to me one of the most important aspects of knowing what's going on the ground is getting those people who live there to let you know what's happening on a daily basis, so that it's not just a scientific or a Western scientific report, but really some ground truthing coming from the communities themselves. So I think utilizing people within the communities, the traditional knowledge that comes from those communities, and the resources that EPA already has as part of their IGAP program, their traditional knowledge or traditional environmental specialists, would be a really good way to keep people informed and involved on a daily basis, and not just from a quarterly or annual report.
Excellent. We have one more question, and I think we'll have to wrap it up after this one. The question is, are there any specific suggestions for projects or directions that participants should pursue with their time and efforts? I suppose that's going to be specific to individual tribes and regions, and but sort of speaking generally, are there suggestions about projects and directions? How about, or even first steps, action items that tribes can take in this process?
This is Sue. I would suggest, just talking with your tribe, your tribal community and tribal leadership about climate change, starting that conversation. From my work with tribes, that seems to be a first step that many tribes need to be doing to get their buy-in into addressing climate change, and that climate change is a serious issue that's impacting the tribe. And then, once you have that support from the community and leadership, then you can work with your tribe to start addressing the issues, maybe planning for the impacts, to start adaptation planning.
Yeah, to follow on with Sue, this is Bull. One of the things that can be done very locally is to, first of all, do an inventory of what existing resources that are most important to the tribe or to the indigenous population and communities, and then second of all, prioritizing that list. And then once that understanding is available, then it's increasing the awareness through education, through outreach with the elders all the way down through the youth. Ways to very simply develop strategies that would conserve or preserve that resource for the long haul. So it might be something as simple as working with the elders to fix just simple faucet leaks if water is one of the more pressing resources. So there's a very simple way to conserve water. Things like including milk jugs in your toilet tanks to help reduce water usage. It's just very simple hands-on things, and use your creativity, working with both the youth and the elders in the community to come up with local ways and strategies that can really minimize the impact on those resources through a changing climate.
And this is Patricia, if I can add a couple of quick comments. One of the things that I have found that's most helpful to all of our communities is really sharing of those stories and solutions of what people are actually doing in their individual areas. We all have very different problems, but we all come from the same basic background, the same cultural experiences, and so sharing of those stories and how we're each individually dealing with them is something that has been really important for all of our communities, not only across Alaska, but really across the Arctic. The other thing is we need to, I think, capitalize on the number of people that we really represent, the number of indigenous people there are worldwide. If we could ever get all of us speaking from one voice, from indigenous peoples on climate change as a whole, that I think we could have a much stronger position, not only in our individual communities, but really on the global stage as well. And I'm hoping that that's where we're headed.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. As Sue mentioned, the recording of this webinar, including this Q&A session, will be archived on the Tribal Climate Change website. And thank you all to the presenters, and for the participants. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate you participating. And with that, I think it concludes this webinar in the series. The final webinar will be on education and outreach regarding climate change, and our presenter will be Mansell Nelson of the Environmental Education and Outreach Program here at ITEP. Sue?
Thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone for participating, and hope you can join us next time. Please contact Christina or me if you have any questions about the webinars or how to register for the next one. And thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.